that we talk about today, whether to comply with or violate international labor standards, are related to a set of economic interests and pressures faced by employers. But as a researcher of labor standards compliance, I feel like I have a very limited understanding of the economic dimensions of these decisions. And a big part of that is that I'm often looking at employers as suppliers from the regulator's perspective, from the multinational corporations or the multi-stakeholder initiative that's trying to evaluate their compliance and incentivize them to improve. So I might learn whether an employer is compliant with fire safety or wage regulations. And then at best, I might learn about the orders placed by a particular buyer at that employer. That's what we analyze in the paper that's going to be in the special issue of the ILR review. We work with one buyer, we look at their purchasing decisions at suppliers. And so as a result, it's a very, that economic dimension of decisions to violate labor standards appears, to me at least, as fragmentary and incomplete. And so in this study, I try to get at the question whether firms that violate labor standards also perform better in traditional measures of economic performance. And the way I've been thinking about it so far is in terms of two literatures that provide sort of competing predictions about this question. So there's a classical model of regulatory compliance that basically sees all firms as kind of like criminals in waiting, just sort of itching to commit crimes and violate standards that make then economically rational decisions to offend. This is really influenced by the economics of crime literature going all the way back to Becker in the 60s. And that says that violations occur for all kinds of regulations because it's profitable to violate them and because they will go unpunished. And so the solution to regulatory non-compliance is to detect violations more effectively and increase penalties so that firms do less of it. This is a really old classical model, but you find it actually, it's still a major part of models in some of David Weil's work and his economic models of non-compliance. And even more broadly, when we think about the literatures and supply chains that are talking about labor violations as a result of economic pressures originating from buyers. The implication here is that managers in these firms are behaving rationally in response to the economic incentives that they face. And on the other hand, there's another couple streams of literature that says, well, slow down a minute, maybe that's not the case. And so the early thinking on regulatory compliance was all in this sort of firms as criminals way of thinking. The more modern models of regulatory compliance often view firms as well-meaning but incompetent. And so violations result to some extent from opportunism, economic rationality, but also as a result of organizational dysfunction within these organizations. And so these sort of modern recommendations about the way in which regulators or firms pretending to be regulators should operate is to try to enable learning, capability transfer into these organizations to support compliance. And there's a kind of, there's a line of research that isn't usually framed in terms of compliance, but I think makes a complementary set of predictions here about high performance work systems. This is more specific to questions about how you treat workers. And this literature that really picked up steam in the 1990s said, the way that you get superior performance, especially in manufacturing, is from training, incentivizing, and devolving authority to employees, not by exploiting them. And so I look at these two literatures and I think, if you look at a set of firms in global supply chains, the group that's out there violating labor standards would be less likely to have these high performance work systems. And perhaps those violations reflect not an economically rational decision, but sort of an overall sense of organizational dysfunction. And I should say, as far as the empirical evidence on these questions go, if we look at Raymond, Drusilla, and their co-authors' paper from a few years back in Better Work, it looked like firms that violated labor standards had lower levels of firm survival. In the study that Rick and I did with the global sourcing agent, we found that quality and on-time delivery performance was worse amongst firms that violated labor standards. So to the extent there is empirical evidence on this question, I see a lot of it leaning towards the right-hand side of this plot here, and then maybe not. But like I said, there's real challenges about the kind of quality of evidence we have. So what I tried to do in this project was to generate a new resource that would have a more complete economic picture of the features of firms that violate and don't violate labor standards. And so I combined a sort of traditional data resource that I would use in my research. This is labor compliance data from audits conducted by a sourcing agent. with a set of economic indicators from China's annual survey of industrial enterprises. So every year, the National Bureau of Statistics conducts a large survey of industrial enterprises that have a minimum of 5 million RMB or 702,000 US dollars in sales. And I tried to link up these two records. This was a huge pain in everyone's collective butts for a long time. The way in which they might appear in the compliance data is DNL Fashion Limited. The way that firm name could be in Chinese would be like the Deli Shi Fuzhuang Youxian Gongsi, which doesn't neither has fashion in it. It says clothing. Semantically, it means virtue, beauty, and truth clothing limited. And so it was a really long process to try to combine these two resources. But ultimately, we were able to put together a resource that matched 527 manufacturers in 2009, average of just over 400 employees, and they're mostly in these export-focused provinces in coastal China, Guangdong, Zhejiang, and Jiangsu. And with that, I'll show you what we learned. All right. So what we found was that labor violators are more productive and more profitable, but export less. So in the first cell over here, I'm showing you log transform labor productivity. There's a measure of output per employee. And it's estimated that firms that violate labor standards are actually more labor productive, to the tune of about 20% more output per employee than firms that don't violate labor standards. And also that translates into their profit margin. So the estimate is that firms that fail these labor compliance audits have about a 1.3 percentage point higher profit margin than firms that pass these compliance audits. For reference, the mean profit margin amongst these manufacturers in our sample is 2.0 percentage points. So this is a pretty substantively important effect here. That's pretty variable, although it's only about 0.25 standard deviations. Now, what's really interesting, though, is that despite being associated with higher levels of labor productivity and higher profits, these firms also export less. Roughly 10 percentage points less of their output is going to exports than firms that pass these labor compliance audits. So my preliminary conclusions about this, and I'm still thinking about these results, but that it seems to me that violating labor standards may be economically rational in a low enforcement setting like China and other emerging markets. In other words, I don't see a lot of evidence here that violations are really best understood as symptoms of managerial incompetence or organizational dysfunction. These firms seem to perform pretty well, even adjusting for varying levels of capital intensity in the varying industries that they belong to. That said, it also appears that labor violations present an obstacle to exporting. And this is a bit of an advance over the past work that Rick and I did on Does Compliance Pay, where we looked at the behavior of one buyer. Here we're looking at the entire portfolio of exports. One of our concerns in that previous research was, well, yeah, maybe this one buyer is reducing their purchasing in response to labor violations, but perhaps other buyers internationally are increasing their purchasing and offsetting that change. What we look when we look at the sort of entire portfolio of exports is that in fact, they go down when firms fail these labor compliance audits. I think that's probably because some, not all, foreign buyers are risk averse and they pay attention to the results of these audits. Thanks so much for your time. I look forward to your feedback.
Greg, that was terrific, and you've got a minute to spare. So we're going to take it and keep going with the next presenter, who is...
Well, it's Chunyun, but she sent me a video to play. I'm going to play from my laptop. It's a recorded presentation since she's in China. So I'll play it now.
Great. Thank you, Kelly.
Hello, everyone. I hope you're enjoying this virtual conference. I'm Chunyun Lee from LSE. I will make this pre-recorded presentation, and my collaborator Sarosh Kuruvilla will attend live and take your questions and comments. This research is based on our larger project, trying to understand the antecedents and consequences of compliance. Prior studies of the determinants of compliance tend to focus on the mechanisms and practices that are external to the global suppliers. For example, when groups of study focus on national institutions such as rule of law, labor treaties, and press freedom, which have been shown to be positive for compliance. Another group of study to focus on the brand's practices. For example, whether the brand link their sourcing practices with the compliance record of the supplier, or whether the brand has stable long-term relationship with the suppliers. Relatively little attention has been paid to the internal practices of the global suppliers. What the suppliers themselves do or not do to implement the standards is not well understood. However, recent research showed that the internal structure, internal practices do matter for compliance. For example, Breakout's paper in 2019 showed that efficiency-oriented practices, such as a piece rate system, reduce improvement in compliance. In this paper, we asked the question, do supplier management practices increase compliance? So we draw on the resource-based will literature to highlight the importance of the supplier's internal practices. The resource-based view of the firm emphasized the firm's internal resources and capabilities as a source of competitive advantage and performance, although they tend to focus on strategic resources and economic performance. And particularly, the strategic human resource management literature has shown that people management system, high performance work system in particular, has positive impact on organizational effectiveness and performance. We extend this insight into the global factory context and also extend the discussion of the outcome variable to talk about social performance. What the global supplier factories differ from the typical companies studied in strategic HRM literature is that they tend to have informal practices, and sometimes they have very basic HR practices aiming to meet just the legal minimum standards. So in this context, we define the construct supplier people management system to include the bundles of factory policies and practices to address workers' rights, welfare, and safety issues. And we argue that effective supplier people management system will improve compliance by enhancing suppliers' capability to resolve competing logics and efficiency and legitimacy embedded in private regulation. The resource-based view literature talk about two main elements of organizational capability. One is organization routines, which can enhance efficiency. The other is about organization condition. That's the manager's attention and the information flow within the organization. We argue that the suppliers' people management system will be able to foster organization routines by setting expected behavior and coordination mechanisms. For example, the steps to deal with workplace conflict or workplace injuries. And these routines will enable the managers to resolve these issues more efficiently, and thus enable them to have more resources and more time to deal with compliance issues if needed. And also, the people management practices in these supplier factories tend to cite legal standards and refers to legal articles. For example, checking the workers' ages and keeping the records of overtime. So these policies will increase the awareness of the suppliers, managers, and supervisors about relevant labor standards and direct their attention to these standards in their daily activity. And thus, we hypothesize that suppliers' people management system will be positively related to compliance with labor standards. We further argue that the suppliers' people management system will show a stronger competitive advantage in meeting difficult standards. It's commonly accepted the compliance across the different standards vary, but there's no consensus on which one are difficult, which one are easy. But a common starting point for most private regulation programs is the core labor standards on forced labor, child labor, and freedom of association and discrimination. These international basic standards tend to be relatively straightforward and also sometimes costly compared to many national standards on like cash standards on wages and overtime payments and also occupational safety standards. So we argue that the suppliers management people management system will enable the supplier to have more efficiency and thus more resources to make these costly and complex standards normally established in the national standards. And finally, based on the arguments of internal fit and external fit in the strategic HRM literature, we argue that suppliers' people management system will be a stronger predictor in the organizational field with relatively unified policies and standards. This is resulting from the internal fit and external fit of these practices in this context. Our data draws on over 2,000 assessments of garment export factories in 7 countries. Our dependent variable is the percentage of compliant items among the 200 or so assessed items. We control for many factors that have been shown to impact compliance. This is the measure of our key construct, supplier people management system. As you can see, many of the items are typical, like basic HR procedures, like recruitment process, termination process, but some of the policies are typical, specific to suppliers in the global supply chains. For example, HR policy that's signed by top management with a clear commitment to meet all legal standards. And another group of policies related to risk management and occupational safety and health. These are the descriptive statistics of the variables that we use. These regression results provide support for the hypothesis as shown by the positive coefficient between supplier people management system and compliance. So the predictive margin shows that moving from 0 item in the system to having all 13 items in the people management system is associated with about 17 point increase in compliance. For the hypothesis 2, we firstly rank the compliance level among the 8 different standard clusters in the Better Work assessment. We then use seemingly unrelated regression to predict compliance with these 8 clusters. And then we rank the effect of these 8 clusters. For example, health and safety is the least compliant and it has the largest effect size, and then we rank it as number 1, and then we do a Spearman rank correlation linking the effect rank and the difficultness rank, and the correlation is negative and statistically significant. We also compare specifically the coefficients across each other. As you can see, when the results are less significant among these easily compliant standards. And finally, we take the advantage of the Better Work structure, where it is all the export factory are mandated to participate in Better Work in 3 countries, that's Cambodia, Jordan, and Haiti. And then we do regression in these different samples. We think that the countries with mandatory participation will have a unified policy and relatively unified standards. And as shown in the coefficient, supplier people management system do have stronger effect in unifying fields than fragmented fields. And then the t-test shows that the difference is significant. So finally, in conclusion, we find that the supplier's people management system is a positive predictor of compliance and is a stronger predictor for more difficult standards in the unifying fields. We check our hypothesis among a subsample of 700 factories and supported my hypothesis. And finally, implication, it's beneficial to integrate resource-based view and strategic HRM literature with even the basic management practices among the global suppliers. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to your comments.
Terrific. Thank you so much. That was great, Kelly. It was great for Chunyun to do that, and she was perfectly on time. And we're going to move now to Raymond Robertson. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the organizers. And can you see my slides okay?
Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much to the organizers and to Rose for chairing, of course, and Kelly and Greg for pulling us together again. This has really been great. I'm going to be talking, as Rose pointed out, about transparency and compliance in Jordan. The motivation, I think, is pretty clear to this group in particular. We know that even though these value chain related exports lead to increase in labor demand, there's a lot more scrutiny about working conditions in exporting factories, and that's why we have this session. Disasters and other reports include all kinds of violations, and all of this audience is very familiar with these. And so it's really important to try and find ways to improve compliance, which is what all of the work of everyone here has been about. But Sarosh and others have pointed out that self-monitoring and voluntary compliance are probably insufficient for improving compliance due to insufficient incentives to address the problems that are found. And there's a lot of literature on that. So one idea that has been put forth has been transparency. And in this context, we mean making the audit information publicly available as a way to increase compliance. But obviously the effectiveness of transparency has been highly debated in both academic literature and policy circles. So the point of this paper is to try and evaluate a transparency experiment. Specifically, what we try to do, or I'm doing this paper, is to see whether or not implementing transparency in Jordan increase compliance with national law and international labor standards. We're using basically a policy experiment from Better Work Jordan to evaluate how transparency may induce improvements in compliance in Jordan's garment sector. And I think all of you are very familiar, obviously, from the previous paper about Better Work. But the implementation of the policy offers a really rare opportunity to evaluate the effects of transparency relative to a comparison group and can illustrate how factories respond to these incentives. So the last couple of papers are really about trying to understand firm level incentives for compliance. And so we have a very unique change in policy that focuses on those incentives, and we're going to estimate how that change in incentives resulted in changes in compliance. The results, just to jump ahead, they suggest that transparency is significantly associated with improvements in compliance, and these results are robust to a wide range of specifications and additional controls. So just the background, I know a lot of you know a lot about Better Work. I don't know how much you know about Jordan. Obviously bordering Israel, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Jordan is very important politically. It's been very important to the United States. That's actually relevant for Jordan's apparel production and trade policy. Wars in the 60s and 70s in Jordan motivated the United States to find ways to support the country. And there was a free trade agreement in 2001, and the US Congress passed a qualifying industrial zone law in 1996 as a way to promote trade. So both of these policies resulted in significant increases in foreign investment, and apparel exports began to grow significantly. Now, the apparel exports were considered somewhat of a success of these policies, since that was their goal, but I'm sure all of you are very familiar with the 2006 National Labor Committee, later called the Institute for Global Labor and Human Rights report, that revealed violations of international standards, labor law, human rights in the garment industry, in addition to poor dormitory conditions, long work hours, inconsistent pay practices. There was instances of rape, torture, and beatings. And obviously these are horrible and egregious, but unfortunately they're not that atypical of conditions of workers elsewhere in the world. So as a result of this report, according to at least common understanding, apparel exports fell dramatically following the report coming out. So that's when Better Work Jordan stepped in. In 1999, all of you know the links in the history of Cambodia. Better Factories Cambodia was implemented to monitor those working conditions, and later it expands on to Better Work. Better Work Jordan begins in 2008, and the transparency program begins in November of 2016. If you're really familiar with Better Work Jordan, you'll know that it began with the transparency element. So originally the reports were made public, but that ended kind of quickly. So most of that initial period was not characterized by transparency. It's also important to mention that Jordan's apparel exports are primarily to the United States, so the United States influence is important, and they did increase after Better Work Jordan begins in 2008. So this is total apparel exports from Jordan. The Better Work Jordan monitors factories once a year and covers all the garment exporters in Jordan, and I think all of you are familiar with the Better Work data in particular. It's we have a unbalanced panel. So along the sort of the vertical axis here, we have visit numbers. So factories are followed in subsequent visits. So they're indicated over time through visits, but they're also tracked by years. So usually firms get, a visit about once a year, and you can see how the evolution of firms goes through time. And we have a total here of 534 firm visit observations. It's unbalanced panel, so there's some openings and closings. Firms enter late. You can see the firms entering here. So this is the number of firms that enter over time with their first visit. And compliance is measured using about 250 compliance questions. This is a box and whisker plot of the median compliance over time that rises until 2002 and then falls and starts to rise again in 2017. And the goal of this paper is to compare the critical issues with other compliance questions. So the way the transparency program worked was Better Work said, we're going to post the results of just the critical issues online. Not all of the working conditions, just the critical issues. So it shifted the firm's incentives to invest in the critical issues, and we're going to evaluate that response using a regression analysis, which is essentially to compare the compliance rates in the critical issues against the compliance rates of other questions before and after the transparency program to kind of catch that shift. And then we'll evaluate robustness with time, geography, factory size, the definition of compliance period, the relationship with buyers, and individual compliance groups. So here's the overall changes in compliance over time. This is with the critical issues, and you'll see here that one of the reasons why you want to focus on the critical issues was that compliance in those critical issues was much lower. The program goes into effect at the end of 2016, and there's two elements here which basically reveal the results, but this is not all sophisticated, but basically you see the compliance in both areas increase following the implementation of transparency, but the critical issue compliance increases much more. So the main results are basically summarized in what's kind of, it's similar empirically to a difference in difference approach. And this difference in difference here measures the change in compliance in the critical issues relative to the non-critical issues after the transparency program goes into effect. So to the extent that the transparency program shines light on this particular group and causes firms to reorient and focus, and in other words, respond to these incentives, you get statistically significant and consistently positive results of that change in incentives. It's also interesting to point out that overall compliance also increases, although the statistical significance is not as strong there. The critical issues, of course, are less compliant generally. If you look at the measures of countries and buyers, and in particular, this is a measure of how buyers are relating to the factories. Better Work has three basic levels of buyer engagement. And so one is not that involved, and this is much more involved, and this is the Better Work Global, if they're just engaged in Better Work Global and not necessarily Better Work Jordan. What you see here is that the compliance, just controlling for those different things, those different levels, shows a statistically significant increase in compliance overall, but you also get the same difference in difference results. So even if you control for reputation sensitivity, It's not being driven just by changes in the buyers. It's not in the paper yet, but I've also looked at all the World Bank programs focused on Jordan, and there's nothing that focuses on working conditions. I've also looked at all the US iLab programs focused on Jordan and the US initiatives generally. And the only initiatives that focus on Jordan are supporting better work. So there are no other exogenous forces that are driving compliance. So most likely it's being driven by this change in policy. We do individual category results in terms of child labor, compensation, contracts, and human resources, discrimination, forced labor. And in general, except for child labor, you see these statistically significant increases in most of these categories, except for freedom of association and collective bargaining, which actually falls. And if you have a question about that in the discussion period, I'll tell you right now, I don't know why that is. I don't have a clue. So anyway, what are we going to do next? We're going to elaborate on additional factors that might affect changes in compliance, and then elaborate on the theory in the paper to look at compliance choice, citing all these papers. Greg, I'm going to definitely get you in there, as you know, and then the rest of the folks mentioned the literature to round that out to develop a model evaluation that reflects that. But overall, right, the conclusions are just we have a consistent positive effects of transparency on compliance in the critical issue areas that are very robust. And the implication is transparency seems to be an effective way to induce compliance with national laws and international labor standards. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Raymond. We're now going to turn to our last presenter. We have Anna Antolin. I'm not sure who is presenting, if it's Anna or Drusilla. One of you can unmute and start presenting. Okay, Drusilla, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. I guess I'm the last paper in the last session, and it's actually well placed because both the work that Greg has done and the work that Raymond has done have really set up what it is that we're trying to address in this particular paper. When social compliance, one of the arguments that originally emerged around the beginning of the 21st century was this idea that social compliance might be win-win-win. And that is that the workers would be made better off by improving social compliance, but workers would also become more productive, and that productivity would have two effects. One is that it would increase firm profits, and the second is that it would allow international buyers to pay a lower price for the products that they're receiving because of this increase in productivity. And so what we wanted to do really is try to come at that question to see what the evidence was about whether that was really true or not. We're going to look at three main questions in this paper. One is there a business case for social compliance, and what is it? Is there a worker well-being case for social compliance? And then also to try to be careful about whether we really know what the direction of the causal arrow is between social compliance and firm and worker outcomes. Now, and this is actually picking up a bit on where Greg was talking just a couple of minutes ago, is that you might ask yourself, well, where is the business case coming from? And the two sides are, it could be coming from the productivity side, and that's what would be driving the win-win-win possibilities. But it could be also coming from the price side. That is that consumers are willing to pay for humane working conditions. And the productivity side is arguments that are familiar to us. One is simply that humanely managed workers are more productive, paying as promised and incentivize effort, and then hungry, thirsty, hot, and tired workers are just not very productive. The second possibility is, and this actually speaks to the second paper, is that social compliance may promote communication and problem-solving systems in the organization, and that also has been associated with improvements in firm performance. And then that you can make an efficiency wage story, which is if you push the wage up above the outside option for workers, that will make them more committed to the organization and harder working. But on the price side, and this is a lot of the work that Greg has been done, and Raymond as well, is that there could be a price side to the story, that either it's coming from a national reputation of social compliance is creating a national reputation for a whole country as having a humane platform, and that attracts business because there's a consumer side to the story, or that you can have humane conditions attract larger orders from a single reputation sensitive international buyers. Now, what could screw up the business case? Well, it's basically these compliance systems are potentially maybe costly. And it may be that the increase in costs associated with social compliance is actually larger than any increase in productivity and product quality. And I know that seems obvious, but it actually, I believe, is kind of the, in fact, and I'm not alone in this, I'm not even the first person to say this, that it's the crux of the issue. So what do we know? Well, on the productivity side, there is pretty good evidence starting in the 1990s, as Greg mentioned, that basically enlightened labor management innovations are usually associated with increases in productivity and product quality. We also have evidence on the price side, originally from Oka, and then Greg and some of his work, showing that social compliance actually attracts larger orders and more reputation sensitive buyers. And then some work that I've done with Raymond gives us a little bit of an ambiguous story, that we know that socially compliant firms are more likely to survive. The question is why? Do they survive because they're more productive, or do they survive because they have better buyers with deep pockets? So the evidence on the business case overall is really pretty elusive. Osterman in 2018 produced a very nice review of all the evidence that we have on this case, and he said it simply isn't there, that we can't find any consistent evidence that firm performance at the profit side level actually goes up with social compliance. There's only one study that I know of that actually nails it, both in terms of directional causality and on what it's been doing to firms, and that's the piece by Levine et al. In 2012, looking at occupational safety and health inspections in California, and they find that OSH inspections lower accidents, lower costs associated with accidents, but having no effect on profits or survival. Then some wage experiments actually find something really kind of curious, which is actually consistent with what Greg was just discussing a couple minutes ago, is that when you do these wage experiments, what you do get is an increase in productivity and an improvement of product quality, but profits go down. And this was the case in the Freeman and Kleiner study in 2005 and the Lolo and O'Rourke study in 2020. And then this work that Raymond is just talking about is that public disclosure seems to be playing a role in compliance. And that really suggests that factories aren't becoming compliant because of what it's doing to the internal organization of the firm. They're really becoming compliant because of what might be doing to its outside observers. So what we did is we ran an experiment. I'm not going to go into great detail because it's a little complicated what our identification strategy is. But essentially, we're looking at a Better Work program, the flagship program, Better Factories Cambodia. We ran the study from 2015 to 2018. And what we did is we randomly exposed factories to the program. And then we looked at two indicators. One is, what is this doing to workers? And the second is, what is social compliance doing to productivity? But before we actually started the analysis, we actually asked managers, and the study, we actually asked managers, what do you think about the business case? So first we asked them, what do you think is the relationship between productivity and working conditions? And 75% of the firms in our sample believe that comfortable working conditions increase productivity. So that's the productivity part of the story. But then we asked them, do you believe there's a relationship between profits and paying workers as promised? And all of a sudden, the answer to that was no. 72% of them, factory managers, said there's no relationship between profits and paying workers as promised. So it's clear that factory managers are making a distinction between the impact of social compliance on productivity and the impact of social compliance on profits. So, and that's exactly what we found, is that hourly pay increased by 41.1% as a consequence of social compliance. Productivity increased by between 25.6 and 32.7%. So essentially what we have is because of this increase in social compliance, we have an increase in unit labor cost. And so that is a pretty red flag in terms of trying to get a business case out of the intervention. And this is actually consistent with results that we have from Vietnam, Indonesia, and Jordan, where essentially what we found is that social compliance increased. We found there that social compliance increased productivity, but it also increased unit labor cost because social compliance is costly. It had increased profits, and that had to have been therefore as a consequence of what social compliance was doing to the prices that firms were willing to pay for the materials coming from a compliant factory. But we found that workers were definitely better off. Weekly work hours declined by 8.8%. Workers were less likely to think they need overtime to earn sufficient income, so that's getting closer to a living wage configuration. Workers were less concerned with low wages. They were less concerned with excess overtime, and we saw an increase in life satisfaction. So the big conclusion here, we feel, is that the customer, if we want humane labor conditions, the customer is going to have to pay. That workers are definitely benefiting from social compliance, and there are productivity gains from social compliance, but the productivity gains are not as large as the increase in cost. So the capital's share of the return to the business is actually going down. So essentially this is, I think, fits in very consistently with what Greg just produced, with some slight variation, very similar to what he just produced. So I'll stop there and let the conversation begin.
Great. Thank you all, both for excellent presentations, really interesting findings, also keeping your presentations to 10 minutes. So we can have, we have fully 18 minutes to have a conversation, and I welcome people to either raise their hand or to put a question into the chat. So who would like to start?
I'll start it off really briefly.
I'm sorry, you were going to provide some discussant.
It's fine. I'm scheduled as a discussant, but I didn't prepare itemized comments per paper. I tried to. Here's the notes, but then I realized, you know what, a couple of the papers, there's basically a big point about the business case being pretty ambiguous. And then it's the sort of, so what? So like, what do we do with that? And who are we telling this story to? I think in Drusilla's paper talking about that workers are actually better off, is the debate somewhere around like we're not achieving full compliance. The factories are not necessarily doing all that better, but we achieve some goal of workers being better off. Is that the end goal? I want to come back to Greg's paper just because he's my friend. I can pick on him a little bit. He didn't bring it up in the presentation, that maybe we're trying to avoid snowballs getting chucked at you, but in the paper, you talk about, you know, you make your point about some factories failed compliance audits. So this is equated to labor violations and still showed higher levels of productivity and profits, but it didn't always lead to greater exports. So that kind of made sense. But somewhere in the paper, you made a point about, you cautioned against viewing the other research on the importance of worker training and empowerment as one of those things that can lead to, you know, that plays into the business case or to making better conditions. So I don't know, I wasn't sure that you didn't want us to take an optimistic read of previous research showing that employee empowerment and training are associated with superior performance. And I wonder if, like, where you're going with that, or to what extent you're going to delve into literature on empowerment, or acknowledging the different nodes in a broad spectrum of what it means to be empowered. Do we need to swap one out for the other, I guess? And ideologically, sort of what it's provocative, and then also what would be the value in that. I think for all of us, as we want to make a case we want to make the business case, we definitely don't want to like inflate findings to make a case for something that isn't there. But where it isn't, how do we pitch that and to what audience? I'm sure this isn't going to, we got to be careful with the research we do, because people are going to read this and it will have impacts for how people act in the supply chain. That's just a general question that I wanted to throw out to all panelists about how we're going to use these ambiguous and otherwise findings and the claims we make. But I'll open up to other questions.
Yeah, thank you, Kelly. That was really insightful and keys us off. I do think we should see if there are some other questions or comments from other panelists or other people in the group participating here. And if not, we can have the panelists comment. Chris Raymond.
Hi, I had just two questions. One specifically for Sarosh. I was wondering if you could expand on the logic of your ranking for the relative ease of the different compliance categories. You mentioned like freedom of association, for example, as on the easier end of the spectrum, but both in terms of the ease of auditing for freedom of association as well as actual compliance, we've found that that's been one of the bigger sticking points. Is it easy in the sense that allowing unions is a relatively straightforward standard, but firms are just choosing to ignore? Or is there something more to that? And then secondly, and this is, I think, a broader question, but a lot of these papers focused on the supplier firm level outcomes and performance. And I was curious for those measuring that, if they looked at brand pricing and specifically thinking about the role of brands in shaping relations within the supply chain. I know Mark Anner has done a lot of work looking at decreasing prices per unit as well as increases in supply costs. And I was wondering if folks could potentially elaborate on that a bit more. Thanks.
Great. Let's see if we can gather a couple of more questions. We have 11 minutes. There's a hand up from Jody Short.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for these really interesting papers. I have a question for Greg, and I have, oh, I'm just realizing my screen's not, and I have a question for Raymond. And both kind of have to do with the constructs that you're theorizing and the measures that you're using. So for Greg, I was just wondering what's the link between the performance measures that are your outcome measures and the sort of managerial competence and organizational dysfunction that you're theorizing? I mean, it seems like there's certainly a way of connecting those two things, but they aren't, in my mind, at least indelibly connected to one another. And for Raymond, I was wondering, so your paper theorizes transparency, but there are many other components to the Better Work program. So I was wondering how you tease out the transparency piece from all the other components.
Great. Thank you, Jody. Other questions? You can either wave at me or you can put your hand up by going to the participant list. Anyone else? Okay, let's have the panelists respond. Try to make your comments brief so we can get another round of questions in. And I have no preference to who wants to go first.
Okay, sure. Just for speed, I'll go first. Thanks for the comments and questions, folks. Let me start with, yeah, Jody, I'm very construct light at the moment. I'm just trying to present, what I'm seeing out there in the world. I do think that there's a kind of contemporary thinking, though, about regulatory compliance that basically says it's almost a proxy for being well managed, and that these things are very closely linked to each other. Now, given all the work that's going on in economics, showing that well-managed firms or firms that adopt structured management systems also exhibit superior performance in a lot of ways. I came into this project thinking there were so many suggestions across various literatures that compliance should move in tandem with productivity and profitability. I was just really surprised to see that result. So I haven't, it's a pretty under-theorized project at the moment. I'm maybe we could talk a little bit more later about, what your thoughts on that issue. I kind of trust you more to make those construct connections. And then Kelly, I think there were just two reads on the empowerment literature. There's one read that says there are these specific interventions, like for example, Drusilla mentioned the O'Rourke and Lolo wages field experiment, where they take a sort of specific set of like creating incentives for employees and generate superior outcomes in some ways. So there's one read that says that in specific interventions, you can get these win-win scenarios where treating workers better also result in superior performance. There's another like broader read which says all labor violators perform worse than all compliant firms. And what I'm trying to highlight here, that at least in China, that's not the pattern that emerges.
Great. Who else would like to comment? Sarosh?
Yeah, okay. So the general question from Kelly about what are we trying to say, in the case of our paper, we are very much similar to Greg. We're sort of basically arguing that there are well-managed firms and less well-managed firms, and we are finding that the firms that are well-managed in terms of having, regular organizational routines about HR, etc., tend to have higher compliance. Why is this, this is what SHRM says, why is this relevant to the global supply chain and the garment industry in particular? It's largely that, the suppliers are a very varied lot. There's a lot of variation. We have some few big guys like Eskel and Crystal and all of those guys. But there's a long, long tail of very, very small factories. If you go and look at the website of ASOS or any big company that is transparent, traceable supply chain out there, you can actually see that most factories are less than 250 people involved, and they are family owned and managed. So clearly there is scope for better management practices. And Greg and his co-authors and Rick Locke in particular have highlighted how building supplier capability has a positive impact on compliance. And so, our argument or the implications of our paper is that not just building supplier management capability in order to adopt lean production systems, but building soft management capability is just as crucial if the goal is to improve compliance and through that, improve working conditions in the supply chain. So it's a fairly simple story in that respect. Chris's question is a little more complex. Yes, Chris, I completely agree that freedom of association is the most difficult standard to achieve for workers in the global supply chain. Our paper is looking at that better work data that kind of shows when there's a violation and when there's not. That's the way the data is structured. So we find that there are relatively few violations on freedom of association, right? And so therefore those become easier to comply with whereas there are a lot more violations in all of those other cash standards. So it's easy to comply with, difficult to comply with in terms of what a Better Work is reporting. Now, in real terms, I think that freedom of association is one of the hardest standards, but it may not be a standard that costs a supplier as much. So there's that issue as well. Okay.
Okay. Drusilla or I guess Chunyun isn't here.
I'm functioning for Chunyun. I just
okay.
I can jump in if there's an opening.
Yeah, sure.
So I feel, this is really to answer Kelly's question, is I feel like the issue really is pretty much settled, that the idea that firms are going to become compliant because there's a business case for it in terms of internal factory structure, I think just isn't there. And and it's not that, and I know we have this evidence that better run factories are more likely to be compliant. It may make it easier for them to become compliant. But at the end of the day, compliance is costly. And even though it increases productivity, it makes profits go down unless there's something coming from the consumer side. And so, when you ask the question, well, who are we talking to? I think who we're talking to is first and foremost the international buyers, and then second to the consumers. That to the international buyers, at the end of the multi-fiber arrangement, there was sort of this mad dash to find out who was going to be the lowest cost supplier in the world. And so there was this tremendous downward pressure on price. and this is the data that we hear over and over again. But there was a second belief among international buyers that that not only were they getting some efficiencies out of reallocating international production to the most efficient producers, we were also going to get some gains because this move to social compliance was going to make firms more productive, and therefore they could get a lower price for their product. And so you end up with these outcomes where some really big international buyers are basically forcing the cost of compliance onto their factories. And I feel like what the evidence is really telling us is that's really wrong. It's really not right that the buyers be forcing the cost of compliance onto their suppliers, and it really is not right for international buyers to expect a lower price simply because they think there's a business case or a productivity case associated with social compliance. And then I think, again, to respond to Kelly, you made this comment that you don't like boycotts, but the bottom line is what really, if the burden of the responsibility for social compliance ultimately lies with international buyers, it also ultimately lies with consumers. And unless consumers are pushing international buyers to be careful about the conditions of work in the factories from which they source, we're not going to have humane conditions of work in factories. So for me, I think that's where we are right now, is we have answered a very basic and important question, which is there is not a win-win-win. This is costly, and the only way we're going to actually get it is if consumers working through international buyers drive a demand for social compliance.
That's great. I do want to jump in here as we have a couple minutes and just point out that Drusilla had raised the article done by Paul Osterman a bit ago on the use of these so-called high performance practices in low wage industries. So is it possible, and what would it look like there? And I think there's some real interesting parallels in the debates going on in the US. So for example, if you look at the large literature on what do unions do, what unions do is they improve productivity and they lower profits. And so, they do have to pay higher wages, and that's why, firms have fought unions. The same kind of debate and dynamic is going on in the minimum wage. So all of the data on minimum wages show that basically employment does not take a hit when the minimum wage is raised. And in the really important work that was done by Sylvia Legretta and Michael Reich out at Berkeley, they basically showed that in fast food, the wage increases were passed on to consumers, and consumers were fine with it. Now, the problem is that's in hamburgers, and that's a modest increase of 5 cents on the dollar. Whereas the context here, of course, is these international buyers putting pressure on the suppliers. But I do think there's some interesting parallels in the debates that are going on in both places. Okay, it is 4 o'clock. I don't know whether we can stay on a minute more.
I think
That's
Raymond, did you want to?
next session, so if you want to stay another minute or two, that's fine.
Thank you all very much for the comments, and I wrote to Jody privately to respond to her questions. So I think we're good. So I wanted to thank Rose for moderating, and Kelly and Greg again for organizing. Thank you all very much.
Take care.